How prepared is Gibraltar for the varied and complex threats of the modern age? Recent spells of heavy rain and strong winds have placed visible pressure on our systems, causing damage to property, traffic congestion across key routes, and some confusion as guidance evolved with the changing conditions. Weather events are often the most visible test of preparedness. They are immediate. They disrupt daily life, and they remind us how exposed a small, densely populated community can be to natural forces. But weather is only one part of the picture. Emergency preparedness goes much further. It includes planning for a wide range of risks, from extreme weather conditions to pandemics, terrorism, or other unexpected events. So how does that planning actually work? How are decisions made? And how ready is Gibraltar, really? To explore this, we'll be speaking with Ivor Lopez, Civil Contingencies Co-ordinator for the Government of Gibraltar. He'd explain the difference between day-to-day weather monitoring and full emergency response planning. We'll also talk about individual responsibility, what we can do as residents to be better prepared, not only when heavy rain is forecast, but in any emergency situation. In the second part of the episode, we'll be joined by Minister John Cortes and Stuart Harrison to discuss how infrastructure, traffic management, and environmental planning all connect to long-term planning and resilience. Drainage capacity, road networks, vehicle management, and, of course, environmental protection. These aren't emergency measures, they are long-term decisions, but they determine how well we will cope when the pressure comes. Today, we look at preparedness on two levels: immediate response and long-term planning, so that Gibraltar is better equipped for whatever challenges lie ahead. Welcome to Not Another Press Release. Ivor, welcome to Not Another Press Release. I'd like to start the conversation by talking a little bit about you and your background for our listeners, so they have another bit of an idea of who the person behind all the planning and all this vital work for Gibraltar is. So tell me a little bit about you and your background.
Okay. I think most people will probably know me, at least in the last 10 years or so, as the Civil Contingencies Co-ordinator, and clearly we've had a number of significant incidents, if we can call it that, during this time. But prior to that, actually, I spent 25 years in the Army, in the Royal Gibraltar Regiment. Actually, I joined just as I turned 19, did a few years as a soldier, but then I had the opportunity of going to Sandhurst, where I then commissioned, and that was back in 96. So really had about a 20-year career as an officer during that time, where I was very lucky to serve in different places, operation tours such as Northern Ireland, Afghanistan, training establishment. I was in North Yorkshire for a couple of years as an instructor there, getting all the trainees from the British Army joining at the time, and very much through an exciting period. Early on, it was all about Russia, the Cold War, the collapse. Well, in the early 90s, it was the collapse of the Iron Curtain at this stage, and then we can see how the world has evolved, and clearly with the issues of terrorism and so on. So it was a very exciting period, with my last 4 years clearly being as the commanding officer of the regiment until I joined here. It will be 9 years in September.
And do you still have an interest in sort of intelligence, geopolitics, that kind of stuff that you were just mentioning right now?
I wouldn't say that it actually finished once I handed over command of the regiment. I think I was actually very lucky as well to be able to get this job, because it was probably the only job I can think of. There was a natural transition of what I was going to do. Fine, I'm not wearing uniform anymore, but I'm still working very closely with each of the emergency services, as I did during my time in the Army, certainly still with the military as part of the Gibraltar Contingency Council, the multi-agency exercises that we do. So that link is still very much there. So I think in terms of the interest, absolutely, but I think it's because of the needs of this job too.
And how do you see the world today? since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
It's interesting how everything goes round in circle, but I think like everyone else who I'm sure will be watching the global news, it is a time of uncertainty. There have been certain episodes during the time, obviously the rise of Al-Qaeda in the late 90s into 2000, and 15 years later with Daesh or ISIS during that time. But now we can see that the state threats that were there during the Cold War are very much there, and then you can see all the pressures, not just with Russia, but certainly other areas in China and other areas of concern. So I think state threats is an area where the world will need to keep an eye on.
And do you think it's true that this thing that's sort of discussed in the space of sort of geopolitics, that the old world order that was based on certain alliances between Western nations, and an idea of what the first world and the second world and the third world and all of these kind of pieces of the puzzle were, is now shifting and is now just like we're in a new world order phase?
Certainly anyone that has been watching the news recently has seen how that is the area of concern. I think if we were to look at NATO, where once probably somebody would think that it was a very strong, I think the conversations more recently has been about whether we are now shifting to a new world order. But it will be interesting times ahead. One of the things that we can be very sure about is that it is becoming more unpredictable, and for that reason, we need to be better prepared for anything that can come our way.
Okay, well, that brings us, I think, very nicely to the actual sort of detail of your job. So we've been working together for just under a year, and I have witnessed sort of firsthand, how you work, how sort of methodical and organized you are, and how you, from the place where you stand, which is a place where you sort of have to do this 360 analysis of how things affect Gibraltar, I imagine all this, the discipline and all the background you got from your military work must have helped a lot.
Yeah, there's nothing that one can do by themselves, and certainly in government at this level. It's all about getting the right agencies and organizations to do stuff. I mean, even I was thinking about it before I came over, in terms of multi-agency working, which is always very important. I can still remember as a 19-year-old joining the army, going on exercise to Canada at the time, that it was called the Combined Arms Battle. It was how the infantry were working with the artillery, with the engineers. And in a way, that is very much what we're trying to achieve today, where we need to work with the police, the ambulance, the fire service, and certainly other government departments to provide whatever effect is required. But that needs a little bit of a coordination. The danger here is when people start working in silos, that you don't give the result that you need. And I think that if I need to describe my job about apart from being Mr. Pessimistic, and actually today is a good day to do that on Friday the 13th, they need to come up with all the negative scenarios that we need to be prepared for. I think it's a question of making sure that you have the right people and things are coordinated. So a good example to look at my department is very much as being the oil in an engine where everything is flowing and given and achieving the direction that the government is setting.
Okay, so I have a list here of some of the things that you've been tasked with in the last close to a decade, and we have incidents like the Grace 1, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, all the work around Brexit and a possible no-deal scenario, an oil spill, IT outages, power outages. Which of these? I mean, some of these are like once in a lifetime kind of situations. Which of these situations, I guess, could you share some anecdotes about what's been most challenging about these things? What things you have learnt about them? What can you share with the audience about what it's been like to face these massive crises?
It's a good thing you didn't go through the whole list, otherwise I'll be sacked, because I'm probably going to be Mr. Butt Luck over here. But yeah, they have been very significant. And of course, Gibraltar has been through significant incidents before I arrived. But I did think that many of the things were one in a lifetime. Certainly, I think that COVID-19, the impact that they had across the board, was immense, and we all saw it in our screens across the world, and it was very difficult times. Not only that, normally when you have an incident, it might go for a few weeks, maybe a month, maybe a year. COVID actually ran for about 4 years, obviously with the first 2 years being the worst. But I think all of them has got the challenges. I think the concern here, that it's all about, in terms of what we are trying to achieve, is about making sure, first and foremost, that people's lives are saved, or that we are preventing further harm from happening. But I think that if I need to choose one of them, and they were all quite big, as we know, I think COVID was certainly the most taxing of all the incident, because it just affected the whole community. It was the community coming to its knees and making sure that we were still able to deliver the critical services, that the hospital had the capacity to deal with the casualties, and more importantly, it was the unknown. Early on, we didn't know how the pandemic was going to work out. We had, obviously, in our screens what was happening in China, later in Italy. That was the first epicenter for Europe, and it was scary times. And at the time that everyone is trying to get the resources, when you couldn't get enough PPE, for example, I think that one felt that Gibraltar was very much by itself, and he'd had to deliver. And unfortunately, I think that we got through the other end relatively well compared to what we were facing.
And in Spain, people were seeing across the frontier, because after Italy, it was Spain, and we were seeing scenes of like hospitals running out of room, of beds, of ventilators, of PPE, and people were getting extremely like worried.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly a very realistic chance that we were going to be hit hard, and actually we were. I mean, the worst period, if I need to put my finger down, I think was the end of 2020, when we had the Alpha variant. I think it was at the time that really spread quite widely before the vaccines actually arrived. And then, unfortunately, many people, I'm sure, will recall the graphs that just started jumping, and we went from hardly any to close enough to 100, and certainly beyond that during the time. And not only were we dealing with COVID at the time, but I remember Christmas 2020, we also had the exit from the EU in the way that we knew it, trying to get the ferries coming in for supermarkets, and all that was merged in the same few days and weeks. So it was difficult times.
Did it take a toll on your sort of health, mental health, your general? I have to admit that I was hit quite hard by, and I wasn't in your position. I mean, I was working in media at the time, but I spiraled into sort of like an anxiety disorder at the time, and I know that it impacted many people. You being in the epicenter of organising a response to this with all that responsibility, how did it feel?
I think it was certainly different with many areas of the community, that people were in their houses and obviously locked down. I think it was probably together with my team, and I'm sorry, it's not just my department. There were many other departments, the ministers and other people involved day to day. But we were working here flat out, as one can imagine, very long hours a day during the weekend. So I don't think that we really had the time to think about that. And tiredness, well, I imagine that we were very tired. But again, you didn't have the time to think about it. You just need to, and I think that adrenaline gets you going. So if anything, you probably suffer the effects after a while. But actually, I wasn't that lucky, because as you read from the list,
it didn't
22,
stop. Yeah.
You then had whether some fires started in our park. Fortunately, there wasn't. Monkeypox, and we had the OO35. The Powers Drive Tunnel fire, and
it never stopped.
So, and that was all in 1 year.
So how are we today? How well prepared are we? Let's talk a little bit about emergency preparedness, one of the key things of your job, and one of the things that we've discussed many times, because obviously there's a communications angle to this. How are we prepared today? For people who are listening to this podcast, are we well prepared?
The answer is yes. But again, we need to tailor that with what we are in Gibraltar. We have lots of advantages. The fact that we are working closely together, we are training closely together. We know that if there is an incident, we can very quickly get the right people in the office in a very short time to deal with that. But on the other hand, we know that we are small. We are not the United Kingdom with lots of general hospitals and specialist organisations. We have what we have. We have the one hospital. We've got limited numbers of ambulances. We've got a finite number of emergency services responders, and we need to work around it. So I think that much of the work that we need to do, and we have lots of different threats where you're dealing with terrorism, you have cyber, accident system failures. You need to have the capacity to be able to initially respond to that, try and maintain the situation as best as possible, but then we need to push those buttons in order to then get the specialist support that may come then from the UK or other areas. But the important thing for us is that, and perhaps people may wonder why they're doing all the exercises all the time, because this is the kind of thing that needs to be ingrained and become second nature. So when it does happen, we need to be very slick in our response. We can't afford to have any delays or do things that we could have done better because of preparation. I think that is very much a core task of what my office, together with all the other emergency services, need to do as part of our work through the Gibraltar Contingency Council.
So in a lot of the conversations that we have, we talk about how to best communicate all these notions to the general public, to try to help them understand that they have a role to play in emergency preparedness, in responding to crises as they unfold. What would we want to say to our audience about emergency preparedness? What kind of information do they need to source? What they need to follow? Can they have an active role in helping the community be prepared?
Certainly, an absolute yes is the answer to that question. And I think that we've actually had our experiences through COVID, for example. It is important that people go to reliable sources, and by that I mean the government and certainly emergency services and our media outlets such as GBC, the Chronicle, and others to get the information. Because nowadays I think there is a danger that there are many outlets out there that people may get the wrong indication. But the one thing the government certainly has done is be very much upfront in terms of having the media channels through social media, press conferences, as the government did during the COVID pandemic. But it is important that people are aware of what the risks are, and more importantly, of what they are expected to do, because the last thing that we want to do is actually make the situation worse if we get people to respond in the way that we don't want them, even if it means keeping out of danger and tuning in to see what further messages we have.
Yeah, I'm going to have do a little plug of our sort of messaging windows and the spaces, the way we try to give out all the information from government. We have a WhatsApp channel that we use now that is very effective at getting information out there quickly. Obviously, there's also all the social media channels. We have an array of websites where we put information out there. We're preparing also some sort of emergency preparedness specific content. Yeah, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we can always improve. We can never sit on our laurels and then say we are happy with our system. Technology is changing. Certainly, the way that people communicated 10 years ago is not the way that we communicate now. But probably part of the reason we're doing this podcast again, because people are changing and we need to adapt to that. But as you rightly said, I think that there is advancements that we can make in terms of having that engagement with the public. I know, for example, we had the radiation exercise that we ran late last year, which went really well. But some questions were asked, where can I get the information? I know that information was out there, may have been in a certain website, but I can also understand that it can be difficult for members of the public to know exactly where to get it. So the idea will be that we will have a central area where you can then have all the links, but I think that that will cover all the main risks that may affect Gibraltar and what people can expect to do in those circumstances. So I think that will be very helpful.
And what are the main risks that we're talking about here?
Well, anything can happen. I mean, pre-2020, if anyone would have said pandemic, I'd say, well, it happens every 100 years, and it happened. The thing is that it's very difficult to predict what things may happen. However, we can, as part of our risk process, we're always scanning the horizon, saying what are the new threats coming in, not just from terrorism, malicious attacks, or state threats that I mentioned, but climate change is something that is here with us, and that will have an effect. But the main ones, I would say, terrorism, that hasn't gone away. The danger is that we need to respond very quickly, because if you don't, then they're going to continue doing harm. So that's certainly one area that we need to deal with. Then we look at Gibraltar, and we are a pretty confined space. We've got an airport. We've got nuclear submarines coming in, although the risk of that being negligible. But nonetheless, we need to be prepared, and we need to deal with the power outages and other areas. We've got the upper rock, the risk of wildfire, certainly in summer. So when you look at the whole area, we are surrounded by risk, and we need to be prepared to deal with those.
And I think it's very useful to put out a message to people that it's always good to be proactive about being prepared. It's always good that we have sort of open lines of communication, that they follow the government channels, that they follow all the information that they can help them, they can benefit from, to organize their lives and be ready for any kind of crisis. You've mentioned climate change, which brings us to the recent popular subject of conversation in our meetings, which is weather. We've seen the devastating floods in Spain recently. We've had a few incidents where we've had a few recent severe weather warnings, several advisories. It doesn't stop raining. We've had high winds. How does the system work now? Because I think that it would be important to send out a very strong kind of message clarifying exactly how the system works so that people understand and it's kind of predictable for everybody.
Yeah. Maybe if I start, I know different countries will have a different system. I know that the UK will have, the Met Office will run with the red, amber, yellow alerts, similar to, I think, the way that we see in Spain. But many of these countries will push out the threat levels or the warning levels depending on the risk that they have. So coming back to the incident that we had over the last few weeks, I know that Spain and all that region, the biggest risk that they had was because the rivers were quite full. The fluvial flooding, which has been devastating, one can now see after having seen the pictures that the reason why they went to that. However, in Gibraltar, fortunately, that's probably one of the things that we don't have. We don't have railways, we don't have rivers. But that's not to get away from the fact that these were pretty heavy rainfalls and very windy conditions. The system that we currently have in Gibraltar, in fact, I'll take you back to pre-2018. We only had one level of a warning system, and that was the severe weather warning. And that came in two parts from the Met Office. You had an early warning or a flash warning. And the way it worked is that if they were anticipating, which is the current threshold at the moment for severe, which is, let's say, 50 millimeters of rain in 6 hours, or wind gusts that exceeds 100 kilometers an hour, then it was a severe weather. The early warning was not allowed to go to the press. It was only purely for planning. But we quickly saw that that had some disadvantages. I remember within months of being here, we had a pretty bad storm that caused the collapse of scaffolding outside St. Dan's School. And then the flash warning actually came after the event. So at that point I said, this can't work. The whole reason of warning, it's in its word, which is you need to warn people. And for that reason, we then sat, in fact, with the new provider, which was Meteorgib, which, by the way, provided an excellent service until the finish in 23 with us, to look at the introduction of a lower tier warning system. So I can, at least the people can be expected to find that things are not going to be that nice during that time. At the time, we called it the significant weather warning, and you had the severe, but you can imagine it can be very confusing. Yeah. That's why a year later we then called it what we call it today, which is a weather advisory, just to make that distinction that we're not at severe weather level. But just to give you a little bit of facts, for example, the weather advisory would be anything from 25 millimeters of rain up to 50, at which point it becomes severe weather. But as you can imagine, we are going to be seeing a lot more weather advisories than severe weather warnings, to the extent that we have about nearly 400% more weather advisories than severe weather. And that is what we need to be careful, that we don't want to be with the public. People might say this is cry wolf, and then when something happens, then we have a big issue on our hands. So that is why we want to do that distinction. That said, we are going to be reviewing our system. I think that we can certainly make improvements in the way that we do it, but hopefully what we really want to have is something that is better understood by the general public, and they are adherent to the advice that we want to do. But that is something that, again, we're working towards.
And then we will also issue sort of case-by-case specific information and warnings depending on the kind of threat.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can have the general advice, which we all know, which is avoid unnecessary travel, or make sure that if you have any furniture outside or any objects, that these are secured. But then equally, as you said, we can have specific advice from the Gibraltar Health Authority, as they did, which is don't go in mobility scooters, for example, to appointments and so on. Or the Royal Gibraltar Police in the way that they did, which was very specific road traffic advisory. So the idea would be that each organisation will have templates, but as you rightly said, we need to also look what is specific and what we are dealing with, because the wind coming from a certain direction might affect things differently. So we need to obviously take that into consideration.
Okay, so for clarity, we have severe weather warnings, and then we have weather advisories, which are a tier below. So if you want to call them, if you like, kind of a more moderate kind of weather warning. Correct, yeah. Then it's important that people also follow the different relevant agencies, police, GHA, the Department of Education, in case they have something to say about the impacts of this. I mean, it's a complicated task, but it's important that everybody goes out there, follows all the relevant channels, and does what they can to follow the advice.
And one thing I should have also mentioned, other than the warning that comes to the public, we have a contract with the Met Office, as we did with the Meteorgib, that twice a week we issue the weather forecast where the areas of concern are. For example, if we were to reach a weather advisory or severe weather warning, and that will then allow them to start planning accordingly. So great work that we've seen, for example, technical services. I know Emil and me that was on GBC explaining the work that they've done, but it's always good to be anticipating as they are doing, looking at where the areas of concern are, so they can then be better prepared to deal with that. So that actually works well.
Then there's the issue which we've also discussed, which is that people will see the alerts in Spain and the sort of the slightly more concerned approach of institutions and citizens on the other side of the frontier, and think, well, why aren't we doing anything about this? And get this sense, this perception that we're not doing anything, without sometimes realizing that actually the weather will affect us quite differently. In this case, in the last case, because we don't have any rivers, or because the storm is kind of moving in a way that isn't going to hit us in the same way. Let's kind of try and make this distinction and help people understand.
Yeah, no, that is certainly something that we've seen, and more so, in fact, I've been here now 9 years, as I mentioned, this time around, because I don't think that Spain has been in and around this region at the red weather warning in the way that we have seen. And I can understand people's concern, because it's only a few kilometers down that way, and they say they are all prepared, as we have seen. And sometimes, before the event actually happens, it's difficult to judge and say how it's going to translate and actually work out until it then happens. I think after then, people then realize why it was that they were at red weather warning level, because of the problems that we've seen with the floods. But on the other hand, we also need to see that we might be indirectly affected by that as well. We have lots of cross-frontier workers that may be affected, as they did, and they might not be able to come into work, and that may also have an impact in many of organizations that employ cross-frontier workers. So again, part of our planning is business continuity, thinking about the areas of saying, if I have critical absences in our staff, how we'll still be able to deal with that. So it's always important to anticipate these issues, hence why we need to keep a good eye on the weather.
Great. Well, just going to send that final message to people to follow official channels, to make sure that they contribute to their preparedness, that they follow all the updates, because there's a whole load of new plans are in the pipeline to make us more prepared and make us more resilient and make us more capable of withstanding any crisis that come our way. And if you want to send maybe a final message to our listeners in terms of, information that might be useful to them, approaches, anything that you might think.
Yeah, I know that a lot of people will see that there's always activity and exercise, and there's a good reason for that. There is a part that we expect the general public to do, and for that reason we're going to be looking at the website that you mentioned. But we are what we are here in Gib with the people that we have in our responding organizations. But for that reason, we need to train and be best prepared for that, because we never know what might happen tomorrow, other than Valentine's for these people.
Which we hope everybody enjoys with better weather, because it looks like the sun is finally timidly coming out.
We booked the better weather for tomorrow.
Yeah. We ask everybody who comes to the show to give us some kind of recommendation of something that they like, something. It can be sort of some kind of cultural reference, some kind of music or movies, or an author they're particularly into. Anything that you've read, or something that's that's special to you.
Okay. Perhaps I shouldn't have been excited, but one of the things I'm actually following when I can is a podcast, and it's from the Journal and the Journalist. Probably might be boring for a lot of people, but it talks about the pressures I think that we are seeing in terms of the world changing and more on the geopolitical scale. And actually, the General is the current Honour Colonel of the Royal Gibraltar Regiment. But it is something that I very much recommend if people have the time to listen to that.
Sounds very interesting. Where can they find that?
I think if you go on Spotify, I'm sure there'll be
the General and the Journalist.
The General and the Journalist. But it's it brings us to reality in terms of what we might be able to face in the future. Yeah.
Excellent, Ivor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, John, Stuart,
hello.
Welcome to Not Another Press Release. Do you like the title?
I love it.
It's the whole point of the podcast is to try and communicate in a slightly more informal way. And before we start, I'd like to start with the disclaimer that we have already issued a few times, but we want to make sure this is very clear. This is a podcast. This is about getting a slightly more personal angle of our senior civil servants, civil servants in general, government ministers, and also to have big picture conversations that we very often don't have the time to have. To see people's visions as to the big issues of our time.
Me parece muy bien.
We are not media. As you know, we haven't turned into GBC or the Chronicle. We are the government press office. And this is another tool for us to be able to communicate information that we think is useful for the citizen, useful internally for the civil service. So we want to start with this disclaimer. Once that is over, tell us, how are you guys doing? How are things these last days?
Okay, well, one of the big things at the moment is the weather, no? Which is affecting all of us, which is quite extraordinary because I've been around for a long time and I can't remember winds the strength we had last week. Although I do remember very wet winters because everybody then had Wellington boots and now hardly anybody has Wellington boots. No? Lots of things going on at the moment. I'm here with Stuart, so really most of this is going to be about transport. Quite challenging. I must admit, I've said this before publicly. When the Chief Minister gave me responsibility for transport, I was not very pleased.
You felt there was a bit of a contradiction,
Bueno,
perhaps?
sí, es que no veía yo de dónde se lo sacó. It didn't seem to make sense, and then it did. And I've actually eaten humble pie since, even in Parliament, because I found the challenge was quite interesting. It really ties in well with environment, but it is challenging, and it is one very difficult to get right in Gibraltar, because we are so small, we have very few roads, and people talk to me about low emission zones, and we're looking at a version of that in part of town without sort of limiting all vehicles and so on anyway. But in other cities, you have parallel roads where you can divert the traffic to. Aquí we only have essentially two arteries on the west and one on the east, so it really is a challenge. Another thing that people don't realize sometimes is how much different things happening in Gibraltar have an impact on traffic and on parking. If you have a development in one area, if you're not careful, they're going to take up to the side of the road and you're going to lose a line of parking that nobody thought of. I found it really useful to have that insight. In places like the Traffic Commission and so on, we're trying to compensate a lot more. And I can tell you one thing, I always put myself on the side of the citizen. And I have arguments with contractors, with developers, with other departments, because sometimes people don't think about the effect on the ground to the ordinary citizen, and I will always stick up for them. So we push back, and we get them to say, hang on, you can't do this, find an alternative, or don't do it now. For example, I had a request to remove parking from an area just before the Christmas break. So the parking would have been removed, there would have been no work there for 2 weeks, with people saying, bueno, aquí qué pasa? So that's been delayed. And we're constantly on it. So I'm always wanting to help the citizen. And I mean, I get approached from housing estates and so on, and we always try to protect their interests. I think I have an overall picture of what's going on in a lot of these areas, and I try to use the experience that I've got. I've been around for a long time in order to avoid problems for the citizen, for the man in the street, the man or the woman in the street.
Actually, on that point, I actually met Stuart months ago on a personal level because of parking issues in the upper town where I live, and the issue was that there's a major refurbishment going on up there at the moment, mostly done, and a lot of parkings were taken away. And as you well know, upper town is a nightmare. And you guys kind of made the idea, or gave us the permission to use the Arengo's car park as a kind
That's
of
right. And
intermediary.
we cleared that.
Yeah,
the upper town is a nightmare. But we are taking steps, and hopefully within the next few weeks, we are going to restrict parking to residents of the area, like we have, for example, in Laguna Estate. Because what happens now is, because much of it is open parking, people will park up there and maybe get a motorbike and go home somewhere else and leave, and that's undue pressure on the resident there. So we're working on that and having a program to try and relieve that. There's also a private initiative to build a car park in the area, which I'm waiting for the details to come. I think it should be able to happen, and I should not have too many problems with planning. And that will relieve.
It's a bit of a game of Tetris up there.
Bueno, pero esto lo que pasa.
Tetris, ¿no?
Yeah, it's I'm sorry que no te estoy dejando hablar.
No.
Pero esto lo que pasa, because, I mean, ideally we'd have fewer cars.
Yeah.
And it's this balance. People say, well, if you don't have any parking spaces, then the car problem will go away. It won't go away. But clearly, if you have a car and it's parked in a garage and you walk or use public transport or cycle or use an alternative, then that's better. But, you know, people will have cars and we have to provide for them, but the message has to be put across, try to use it
Try not
the
to
least
use
possible,
it, for sure.
For health reasons, air quality reasons, and parking reasons.
So we've had a few weeks of really bad weather. It looks like it's not going to let up in the next couple of weeks. Is there anything maybe that we would want to communicate in terms of how we interact with the weather in the coming weeks? Like what challenges we're going to be facing?
Thing is that sometimes these weather advisories don't turn out to be as bad as they say. They have been in last week in particular. Sometimes they don't. So I always take them with a pinch of salt, because sometimes it's a weather system that can move just north of us, for example, and you can have huge floods in Valencia, like happened a year or so ago, and we got nothing here. So always with a pinch of salt, but be aware. I think the biggest problem here is high winds, because rainfall with high wind will mean that the rain can come horizontally and insert itself in places that you wouldn't imagine, because you always plan waterproofing from the top. And that's where you get water ingress in places that you wouldn't normally get. And because we're not in a floodplain, we're not next to a river, and we have increased the capacity of drainage in Queensway, Wellington Front, Jumpers and so on, we don't get the floods we used to have. That is not so big a problem. The biggest problem is the wind. And we've all seen the videos of furniture flying around. So people should not leave lightweight furniture on terraces, en la azotea y la terraza, no? And obviously, you never know what might get loosened in a high wind. We've lost probably just under a dozen trees which have fallen over, or because it's been so wet, the soil has become loose, and particularly if they're evergreen trees, if they're deciduous trees, they don't have leaves, they don't have the sail effect. An evergreen tree gets soaked, becomes heavy, the wind blows, the soil is loose, and it tilts over. If you go near the airport, there's a huge ficus tree that we're having to take down because it just collapsed. So those are things that you have to guard against. That's why we close the Upper Rock, and that's why the Alameda Gardens, which I used to close in heavy winds when I was its director, because trees can fall. And obviously another thing that happens with heavy rain is that it dissolves some of the soil that sometimes binds together the rocks on the Upper Rock, and places like the east side become prone to rockfalls. So it's places that you need to be very, very wary of. But having said that, we don't get heavy snowfalls. I've got lots of friends in the overseas territories in the Caribbean, and they have real hurricanes which last a lot longer, virtually every year. So, por mucho que nos quejemos, it's a
bit of perspective is useful.
Yeah. But bueno, everything is important. Huh?
And Stuart, from perspective of transport, traffic becomes, in one of these like bad weather kind of several series of days, becomes very difficult to manage, no?
See, and everyone gets the car out, and obviously then they want to use public transport, the buses get filled up, massive traffic, everyone gets late to work, and the implications are quite big, no?
And you also have the issue when the rockfalls happen and the east side closes, there's only one way around the rock.
Yes, so again, all these things have an impact, and it's for us to try and juggle, and it is a juggling act. There's no real solution. It's like feeding Peter to feed Paul, and then we'll take from Paul to feed, and then we're constantly moving the jigsaw puzzle around for it to work as best as possible.
Yeah,
because one of the things that you've done in these times, and Stuart does most of the transport work, although we've got a really good team. We've got our transport planner, we've got our highways people, we've got our car parks people. But in relation, Stuart does a lot of work with the bus company, and we are quite pliable when it comes to bus routes. When the east side was closed off, we changed our buses. We had to take them round Europa Point, so we responded. But I'm old enough to remember when there was a huge landslide where the Talos slope is now, very near San Centenary. And for many years, there was no way to Catalan Bay or Sandy Bay other than from Europa Point. That road was completely closed. I remember as a child, you got up there and there was a little track that you could walk along, but you couldn't drive along. So, it's not as bad as that.
Correct me if I'm wrong, there was a tunnel, not before, that used to exit.
You used to go through the tunnel, which comes out at Catalan Bay.
See, but it comes out in a movie.
And it came out there by the bus stop.
Vito.
You're not old enough to really.
No, I've heard.
Do we
Yo
have
sí.
clue missing ape?
Sí, sí, sí.
Tell me where on Severico. No, silent. You can see the whole old infrastructure.
But I must say that the buses, I mean, I think we've got a really good bus service and very responsive and responsible and lots of plans for the future.
And correct me if I'm wrong, electric buses are coming soon
Exactly.
as well.
Yeah, we hope to have them in September, no, Stuart?
See, I think I've got to go out in August to see them to make sure they're okay with the manager, and then obviously they should be here for September.
So that's 6 new buses, fully electric for the upper town routes.
They're not going to replace existing buses.
They're going to replace the existing buses in the upper town. They're very comfortable, electric, non-polluting, which is great. And we've tried them out. They go up the hills. There was a full tender process there. But the older buses, some of which are not in very good condition, there's no secret, those that are better, we are going to be able to redeploy. And we're looking at the possibility of an additional route in the South District, because the buses go up Europa Road and then the lower ones go down to St. Joseph's. But there's that whole hill up by Cuello House and so on. And there are some older people living in that area which don't have public transport. So we're looking at the possibility of reconditioning some of those to do a new artery up on the South District, which I think people there would appreciate. There's also been suggestions that we take buses all the way to Little Bay. Again, they have to be small because they've got to fit in through the tunnel, so these are all options. But the main thing is that those old buses need replacing, and really excited to get the new electric buses in.
Yeah, I think to add to your point, the South District, I think Loughborough Barracks should now become probably like the hub for sports, especially with young children.
And bands as well, we all rehearse there, most
See,
of us.
these buses should be able to get up there as well, so therefore this new route that would be crossing through the South District, the aim is to go there as well.
Europa Road and up to Loughborough.
Make it a lot more. How many people are going to Loughborough Barracks on a daily basis? Yeah. And there's no bus service anywhere near, no, especially in this type of weather. So we're looking again. I think it's how Gibraltar is evolving, no, and it's the fact. You said it before about the bus and everything else. The relationships that we have made in the past 2 years with all stakeholders in transport, I think that's what makes it work, you know?
Yeah, we're working very, very closely together also with the Taxi Association. As you know, we're looking at bringing London-style taxis to do the airport and the city service. We're working closely with them. They've improved in their commitments to providing an airport service, and we facilitated a lot of things. So I think we're making a lot of progress with improving the taxi service as well, working in partnership with the association.
Yeah, others. I think with car parks again, with the
car parks as well. They're very responsive. There are issues in car parks, and one of the biggest issues in car parks is vandalism. And there we found that there was a little bit of almost falling between stools. Where does enforcement come in? How much is the police responsible for? How much is it not? But we've established a very good working relationship with the RGP. I've met with the commissioner several times. We've set up regular meetings between our transport team and the police. And we're also going to be doing a campaign to try and tackle vandalism in the car parks. So all these things are happening. You've been involved in that as well.
Yeah, again, it's about the relationships that we're making. No, the RGP, the same thing. There's a lack of connection with lots of different entities. No, they're in silos. I think what the ministry is doing is bringing the silos together so everyone understands the full picture.
Yeah. I love bringing people together. I love having people in a room, set our targets, and then meet regularly. I do this with everything, and not just with traffic. Whenever we've got a project on a new school or whatever, I make sure that we have monthly meetings of all the stakeholders. The meeting might take 5 minutes, or it might take an hour. But like that, we drive it. If there are any issues that I can help in, coordinating with different ministries or departments and so on, and it really, really helps. I don't interfere because I like people doing their work, but I'm there to support. I'm holding regular meetings now on the expansion of St. Martin's School, St. Joseph's expansion, and on the new college. So all these things, we've got to do it. And on transport, as I say, we meet regularly as a collective with representatives of car parks, the buses, the licensing DVLD, me voy a olvidar de alguien, después se va a enfadar conmigo, highways, technical services, and we get in a room at least once a month and we thrash everything out la verdad que we make progress. And I think we're also quite responsive. We've got emails that people can write in, and they're monitored regularly, and we respond as much as we can.
Do you want to give us those emails in case someone wants to...
mt@gibraltar.gov.gi, Ministry for Transport, MT.
I think there's also the angle now that maybe people go to social media as your first point of contact to complain or maybe put something across, and they don't generally contact the right avenues that you should.
Es un problema because we don't monitor social media specifically for that. Y a veces se escapan las cosas, or it's a little comment in reply to somebody's reply to somebody else's reply, and we're expected to pick it up and deal with it. We may not have seen it. So if you want to put it in social media, it's your right to do so, but also send it directly, because we like to be able to respond. Sometimes it's a difficult problem. Sometimes it's very easy. For example, little things that we do. We put a pelican crossing in Queensway, because people walking from town and crossing into going through the Chiltern Court area to get to the health GHA or whatever, there was no crossing. We put one in. We've been asked for a crossing also at Montague Bastion, because a lot of young people crossing from the youth clubs, and it was dangerous, and that's work in progress now. Other things like that we like to be able to respond to, but sometimes we're not aware that these issues are there. So please, mt@gibraltar.gov.gi. Don't do like the Chief Minister did on television a year or two ago, where he gave my personal email
He did it
to everybody.
a couple of weeks ago again.
It's all right, john.cortes@gibraltar.gov.gi. I'll reply if I see it, because I get a lot of emails every day. But yeah, we've got this dedicated email which is monitored.
Talking about the electric buses, I think gives us a good opportunity to segue into another topic, which is the environment, which, I mean, maybe sure is not the field that you're working in, but I think this is something that impacts us all as citizens of this planet. And I would like to have a slightly more kind of big picture conversation about how you see the world right now. And there feels like the whole climate change conversation has changed in ways that I think a lot of us around the table are not going to be very happy with. How do you feel about the way?
Okay, so clearly there's a major player, the United States, that has pulled back from its climate change commitments. I'm not going to interfere in the politics of another country. It's there.
The EU is also rolling back now.
Yeah,
very timidly, but but still
not as much. The EU and the UK, in some respects, surprisingly, it surprised a lot of environmentalists that the Labour government is not as proactive on the environment in some areas. In other areas, they're doing a lot of good work. In some areas, I think environmentalists expected to see progress quicker. But I don't think that there's anywhere near the pushing back. I think they're taking more realistic decisions and less idealistic decisions. I remain an idealist, but I'm a fairly practical idealist.
But do you think the consensus has changed?
I don't think so. As I say, there is no doubt at all that climate change is the biggest existential threat to humanity. Any scientist will tell you that, and people who are not scientists realize that. So we talk about the instability of the world affairs, the geopolitics, all these things. Climate change is probably trumps all that. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it here with more severe weather. We're seeing it across the world. At the same time as in North America, they had sub-zero temperatures. A friend of mine in Australia was letting me know that it was plus 49 degrees Celsius. You know, that is unlivable. There will be parts of the world where the human will not be able to survive in the open because it's too hot. So, and that is a result of climate change. Por mucho que digan que no, que es natural ni nada, there have been cycles in climate in the world's history, but there are two big differences there. One, it never happened this quickly, and two, our species wasn't living. I mean, we haven't gone through those changes. So we've had ice ages and so on, but not these drastic changes. No, so it is a serious problem. Is it too late? Sometimes I wonder, but it's very disappointing when countries and particularly industry and big business doesn't really seem to be realizing that this is a big problem.
And you say that you're not sure about the consensus, but the consensus is something that we need, that politicians need in order to implement policies that have the backing and the legitimacy.
I think the consensus is there, with the big exception that I mentioned. I think Europe is still working towards the environment, and many countries in Europe are working in the right direction. So I think the consensus is there. Perhaps people have almost given up sometimes, but we've got to keep pushing. So I think the consensus is still there. I think people are still aware. I still have hope, but it's going to take a lot of work.
What about here in Gibraltar? How are the spirits in your team?
Here in Gibraltar, I think that we are doing well. Certainly we don't have the extreme right entities that they have in other countries, and for some reason extreme rights doesn't seem to acknowledge the importance of climate change. That may be because often it's big business, and any change in sort of the oil-centered economies will affect their pockets, big pockets though they are. But I think here we do have consensus, and I don't want this to be a political thing, so what I'm going to say is not going to be a negative political thing. When I am challenged in Parliament about the environment, it's not because I'm doing too much, it's because I'm not doing enough. So that means I'm comfortable. I always say I'm never going to be able to do enough for the environment. Never, por mucho que yo trate, y mira que trato. So I don't think we have that problem. I think that the government, remains on track, and certainly our policies are still environmental, like they were in our Green Gibraltar Manifesto. Certainly I have tremendous support through the whole of the cabinet on environment. So I don't think that is a problem here. How are we performing? I think we're doing well in a lot of areas. Our air quality is better, and I need to publish some updated figures, which you in the press office need to chase me about, because there's good information there. I think we are moving towards alternative transport. Most cars sold now are hybrids, moving towards electric. We're trying to improve our electric infrastructure. We have various solar projects coming, developing now for alternative renewable energy. We still don't have a sewage plant, and I always say, it can be seen as my biggest failure to date, but we are making progress. We now have a contractor on board. Again, that's one of the areas in which I'm having regular meetings with all the stakeholders to make sure it happens. So I believe it's going to planning within the next couple of months. So we are going to see progress there, and that would be a great relief. I've said before, and I'm not going to bore people now, it's been, a series of circumstances totally beyond our control that have meant we haven't got there yet, but we're nearly there. So I think we're doing okay, but we can always do better.
Okay. How do you feel, for example, and it happens a lot in climate change, there's all these initiatives that require very complex policy making to sort of create these small little gains in these little fields, and then you have this massive industry that just has this massive negative impact. For example, in Gibraltar, we have this massive bunkering industry. Can we really move forward?
Okay, well, bunkering is an interesting one. And here I've made it very clear, my feeling on this. I would like the world not to revolve around oil. And we're seeing a lot of talk internationally about oil, and oil from here, oil from there, using oil almost as a bargaining chip. I think the world has to move away from oil. It is going to run out, not immediately, but it is contributing to climate change tremendously. But I'm a realist. It's not going to happen tomorrow. And if we were to stop bunkering from Gibraltar tomorrow, it would go across the bay or across the States, to Algeciras or Ceuta. So we're still going to have this area responsible for the bunkering. Somebody else is going to be bringing in the money. So while that's happening, the economy of Gibraltar was sound, because like that we can move forward on environmental, social, educational projects. Not that it all comes from there at all, but we are not going to solve the problem of bunkering, which is an international problem, by pushing it away from our shores.
But that's an argument also that a lot of European nations make. No, as long as China is polluting the way they pollute, as long as the US is polluting,
but
we don't really make much of a difference.
Well, I don't know, but the clout of Europe as a whole is much, much larger than Gibraltar. Yeah. So I'm not making it an excuse, because obviously I would like ships to be able to sail on something that isn't petroleum. Yeah. But the industry is moving, and they are certainly working, certainly reducing sulfur, reducing emissions. They're aiming in the long term to convert to LNG, for example, which is fossil fuel, but pollutes a lot less. So I think in regard to bunkering, we are relying on the industry internationally to clean up its act. And I know that the local players are very much on top of it, and they are doing things like carbon offsetting and so on. Mm-hmm. But I think even though I'd love to see bunkering stop, it's not something that would make a significant difference internationally. Locally, I think it's a much cleaner operation than it used to be. I remember 20, 30 years ago when I was in Gons campaigning, because we used to have these bunker smells almost on a daily basis. Now it's exceptional, and usually it's not bunkering that's causing the smell. So the act has cleaned up tremendously. It's an interesting conundrum. Yeah. Because obviously I would like there not to have to be, but it would be unrealistic for us to push it to Algeciras or to Ceuta.
Yeah, and it's the art of compromise, no? It's the world of governance.
Pero importante eso. I mean, I don't like to call it compromise, but I think finding solutions, finding workarounds. And I often find this. I sometimes get developers coming to me with projects que digo, oh, Dios mío, esto no puede ser. And I tell them that. I mean, I think I've got a bit of a reputation with them. But then I engage, and we end up improving the product. One example I can't think of any right now, but certainly a lot of developments that have happened have improved because I bring in my environmental background. That's my profession. So I think I've got a contribution to make there.
Speaking of like the environment and everything we've just spoken about, like, what do you think will be the issues that will define Gibraltar in the next 5 to 10 years from that point of view? Because obviously we've spoken about climate change, sort of bunkering, but you know, the water treatment plant, obviously that's going to be a big thing onst it's there.
The treaty that's coming,
well.
how is that going to impact?
All right, okay, so so we are going to have a wastewater treatment plant. We're going to have a solid waste treatment plant, which will be environmentally friendly, because otherwise they're not going to certainly get through my filter for what that's worth, but it wouldn't get through the planning process. But what I've seen so far, I'm confident that we will tick the right boxes. The treaty, I think, is exciting. I think that it's been really, really a good piece of work that certainly Chief Minister, Deputy Attorney General and the whole team has come up with. I have obviously seen and given my support to all the environmental aspects of it. They will be published sooner rather than later. I'm going to be meeting with the environmental NGOs to go through it with them. We've had a briefing from the Attorney General to my environmental team. I think it's very sound. It doesn't compromise us in any way. It supports all the work that we are doing and want to get done. And obviously, it requires us to keep to international standards and environment. And to me, it gives me great comfort. When we left the EU, I was quite worried that we wouldn't have this supranational organization ensuring that not just this government, but future governments look after our environment. I think the treaty really gives us strength, and it gives the environment a tremendous amount of strength. So I'm very happy with the environmental aspects of the treaty, and I've told everybody who asks me that, including the NGOs with whom I've had informal conversations when they've asked me.
And that's going to be also interesting from a transport point of view, because if the border is now free-flowing, like with the border at the moment the way it is, the queues that end up being created kind of eases up the traffic flow in Gibraltar. So, you know, you get to Devil's Tower Road and that steady flow of traffic is coming through steadily. Once that disappears, it's going to be an interesting...
You haven't been on Devil's Tower Road in the morning in a while, no?
I have.
It's Stuart's biggest nightmare, Devil's Tower in the morning.
It's every day.
Because once the border actually disappears and everyone's able to drive in and out,
Well, no.
the traffic flow
Which
should
is-
increase.
It will increase, and it will be moved. It will be shifted to that part.
So you guys have a
Well,
mammoth task.
it's a
ready
big
and
task,
waiting, yeah.
and different things are being looked at. The actual design of the traffic in the area is being worked on. There'll be new roundabouts, and hopefully there won't be any accumulations at the border itself. Various things are being talked about. I've seen a proposal for a multi-story park and ride sort of. It's not at the moment. It's not. I'm not saying that this is what's going to happen, but I've seen somebody come up with that proposal. No quiero que me digan que yo he dicho que vamos a hacer algo que después no pase. So that's one option, but we have to ensure that our roads don't get congested, and we are looking at different alternatives. And my transport team, which I say is very, very good, is looking at that. But it's one of the challenges. I mean, the treaty will have lots of good things. It'll have challenges.
Yeah, we have to adapt as we learn as
Pero
well.
tú sabes, Gibraltar is very resilient and very adaptable. We have come through much worse problems than this, which isn't a problem. We're going to talking about the treaty. The alternative would have been a collapse of the
Much
border.
more problematic, yeah.
Y que te digo, ¿no? There are those who say, bueno, que cierre la frontera como en el 69, pero it's a different world.
That's a very nostalgic comment, for especially the older generation. no?
Yeah,
It's
I
like,
lived through
well,
it.
we lived through it. We're fine. Look at us
Yeah,
now.
but it's a very
Yes, but
different
it's
world
very different.
today.
It's a very different world.
Different expectations, no? And
I think it'll be
demand.
interesting because one of the things that I think need to happen with this new treaty is that we have to start trusting things that have become quite difficult to trust, no? And I think that in the work that your departments have been doing in collaboration with partners from across the frontier, you've developed relationships of trust, no?
Well, yeah, I can tell you that certainly from the environment perspective, I've got lots of contacts across the border, which I've had from well before I was a minister. There is one particular organisation, I'll mention it, Verdemar, who I think are very unfair and disloyal to the conversations that I have had with their leader. And this is something that I will be taking up. But apart from that, where I think there's a political motive, not pure environmental, I think that Verdemar, Ecologistas en Acción, has lost a lot of credibility by becoming political, and I say that publicly, and I say it to Antonio's face. I've always considered, him a friend. Now I'm not sure because there's a lot of politics coming through. But apart from that sort of anti-Gibraltar
Agenda.
agenda. Everybody else who I know in the world of environment, including NGOs, including scientists in the area, there's lots of good communication. There's lots of respect. They respect everything we've done for the environment. They're very impressed, for example, in our 25-year environment plan. They've asked me to give a presentation to a conference which is going to be held in the University of Gibraltar, actually, but for the whole Campo de Gibraltar, because they're so impressed at the work that we do. So there's a lot of rapport there.
And in terms of treatment of waste and recycling and things,
well,
collaboration now for a long time.
We rely on some of the plants there to treat our recyclates and so on. So there is a relationship there. But clearly, I mean, we have our history. So no vamos.
And trust is very difficult to build and very easy to
exactly,
destroy, no?
and we're not going to be blinded. We have our history, but we're confident. I mean, we're confident in who we are. We're confident in how we can stand up for what we believe in. We've shown it in the treaty negotiations. Bring it on. We'll be fine. I have so much belief in the Gibraltarian and our ability to adapt and to face all the possible difficulties. If we can face difficulties, then we can also face opportunities. So we have to now concentrate on the opportunities, always having our red lines, always protecting who we are, our identity, our sovereignty, our nationality. But let's get on and let's take over the world.
Not another press release. I can't read.